O'clock, the Fish and Wildlife Department and the Agency of Ag are coming in to give us some additional information to help us with the rodenticide bill. And then we're taking other testimony this morning on our miscellaneous housekeeping bill, which we haven't looked at for a while, and then the homeowners associations on our right to grow vegetables bill. So we're another day where we're going to be covering quite a lot. To start things off, though, I asked Ledge Council to come back in and show us an edited version of the farm worker employment bill. So we took testimony before the break, and then we had NOFA in yesterday. Based on that and what I'm sensing from the committee, I suggested that we look at an amendment that takes the overtime piece out altogether and takes the housing survey out altogether. Not that we haven't heard that housing is a critical issue, and we, ideally would be investing even more money than we already are in that, but that in order to move forward, maybe we ought to focus just on the minimum wage piece. So we're just going to look at that now and not planning to vote on it. If we have time, we'll have discussion. Getting a late start here, I recognize, but it's now a pretty short amendment, I think. So if you want to bring it up on the screen.
So Sophie Sadatni for the Office of Legislative Counsel.
It's also on our committee page.
So the one that says amendment?
Yes, it says 403 amendment.
So this does a couple, again, I think just to reflect what the chair said, this takes out the overtime provision. Before there was language around overtime at 60 hours a week for agricultural workers, and it also removes the reference to the housing. So this now is streamlined. It focuses in on the minimum wage. And again, the way the minimum wage is structured in Vermont statute is you have this definition section in section 383, and then you have, which defines who's covered by it, what an employee is. And then you have the actual language on the calculation of the minimum wage and the overtime. So 383 on the definitions, an employee means any individual employed or permitted to work by an employer except, and then right now it excludes individuals employed in agriculture. So what this does is it limits that now by adding this language, provided the individual is the agricultural employer's parent, spouse, or child. So in other words, it's now scooping in individuals employed in agriculture as being covered under this section of state law. At the request of the chair, I also included the rest of the exclusions because I thought that would be helpful. So again, domestic service in or about a private home. And again, this just goes back, again, this is historically, right? Domestic servants and agricultural workers have been excluded from a lot of employment laws. Individuals employed by the United States, but I think pertinent for this committee is subdivision I, students working during all or any part of the school year or regular vacation period. So again, that's a general exclusion of students from the definition of employee for purposes of minimum wage and overtime across all occupations. And then section 384, because you've now under.
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
So are you saying we're creating that excluding youth, or we're just keeping it as it already is? This is already the existing
Yes.
statute. We're not changing that.
Right. The only change would be that the underlined bit up here, which says any individual employed in agriculture, provided the individual is the agricultural employer's parent, spouse, or child. So in other words, all other agricultural employees would be now covered. So then going to the subsequent sections.
Sorry, another question.
We heard this before, but does student ever get defined? We have questions about that.
Yeah, so there are labor laws both at the federal level and at the state level. And those are child labor laws. So those are done by age. Student itself is not explicitly defined. I think it's been understood to refer to students as in, minors, like under the age of 18, those that are attending school. So, and again, there are rules around what you can do as 13, 14-year-old, a 15, 16-year-old, a 17, 18-year-old. And I can share those with the committee if you're interested. I know not today, but so this is the current law on minimum wage. So again, it's an employer shall not employ an employee. So again, now you've brought in agricultural workers as an employee. And then what Vermont does is it has this calculation that's done each year. So right now, the current state wage for minimum wage for 2026 is $14.42 an hour. And that, gets calculated each year. Usually towards the end of the year, it gets posted for January 1st. And then under subsection B is where you get into overtime, and you say that employees will be paid, 1.5 times their regular wage rate. And then there's a list of exclusions. Because you've now added agricultural workers into the definition of employee, you then have to take them back out again as being covered by the overtime provision. So what the new number 9 does here is it excludes individuals employed in agriculture.
I wonder if it would be helpful to see what 1 through 8 are there. So what other
Yeah.
employees?
So it's typically ones that are covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act, which is the federal law. And so, you may have heard the expression exempt, non-exempt employees, right? So non-exempt employees typically are covered, get overtime, whereas exempt employees do not. So it's the administrative, professional, it's all those long lists. And I can certainly provide that. I could include it in here if you want.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know whether.
I can pull that up in a second if you want when I finish going through this. And then this would provide that the act would take effect January 1, 2027. Usually with any minimum wage laws, they go into effect January 1. And this would also provide time for individuals impacted by the change to prepare for that. And then the current name of the bill doesn't really fit what you're now doing. So this recommends that the title of the bill be amended to read an act relating to payment of minimum wage to agricultural workers to reflect what it actually would do.
So that's it. We've gotten to the end.
Yes.
I think we should talk about the housing deduction, because that's a concern. And Sophie and I were just downstairs speaking about this bill in the housing committee, since in a drive-by situation. As I understand it, Sophie, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but if an employer is paying, and I'm going to make this a general example, so not an agricultural example, but an employee has housing, and if an employer is paying $17 an hour, let's say, to an employee, and they're also providing housing, that the employer can deduct a certain amount for housing, and it's established in law. And once they make that deduction, they still have to be over minimum wage. Is that how it works?
Right. So if you deduct for meals and lodging, the employee still has to be receiving minimum wage. They can't go below minimum wage.
So the amount in their paycheck has to be above minimum wage.
Right.
Okay.
Even if you're supplying full housing, heat and lights, if you have an employee living in a ranch house with his family, and the ranch house would rent out for $2,000 a month, that doesn't count towards his wage. He still has to at least make minimum wage.
That is my understanding, that you're still required to provide the minimum wage. Let me double check on that. So many bits of paper on this, so. Um. An employer may apply wage deductions as follows, and then there's a list. An employer may deduct for goods or services provided by the employer to the employee if the following conditions are met. The deduction does not reduce an employee's wages below the hourly minimum wage.
So what you've put up on the screen here says effective January 2026, employer shall be entitled to deduct from the wages an allowance for meals and lodging actually furnished and accepted as follows. And then we see a breakfast number and a lunch number and a dinner number that are whatever they are, okay? I think that we've seen numbers when we've talked about school meals that are sort of in this ballpark.
And prisons.
Yeah, and they seem like almost impossibly low, and we know that some schools struggle, but they do manage to produce for, an entire group of people, a breakfast that might cost $3.92. Lodging, $5.41. Seems to not fall into that category. I mean, I don't know what it costs to lodge in a prison or in the correction system, but I believe it's more than that. Sophie, can you say a little bit about where this number comes from?
Yeah, so it's calculated every year, again, just like the minimum wage. And it's in statute. The Department of Labor is directed to do this each year. And then this is the formula that they use, again, since 2009. So it's both in statute directing the Department of Labor to do it, and then it's in the Department of Labor's rules.
Representative Lipsky.
So you're telling me that the consumer price index since January 1st, 2009 brought that room up over 17 years, up to $5 a night for a room.
I'm not sure where it started at, but
$5.41. Well, it must have started
very low,
$2 a night, or
right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's absurd.
At least my
Right.
property taxes should be a lot lower.
Well, I'm just wondering also if these numbers are, if farmers are aware of these numbers, if there might be unintended consequences with this where farmers start paying minimum wage, but then they start charging for this or just take it away because it's not worth it.
This meaning housing?
Housing and food, yeah. I mean, it's so low that you could, if you were a farmer, you're like, I'm gonna pay you $20 an hour, but you gotta find your own housing and your own food.
Representative Boston?
No, I didn't.
So
I could rent my houses out and make enough money to make up the wages.
So basically what this is saying, if you can go back to that slide, just go down rather a little bit. So what this is saying then, again, repeating, I think what you just said, but when you deduct $5.41 from the daily paycheck, whatever number you arrive at would have to be the minimum wage per hour.
So right now, for agricultural employees, they would be governed by the federal minimum wage. So at the federal level, agricultural workers are entitled to the federal minimum wage. They're not entitled to the federal overtime. So right now, and again, that's at a very low rate. I think it's $7.25, which it's been since 2009. So right now you could probably afford to do this. I would say when there was the study group on agricultural workers, I think if I recall, some of the testimony was along the lines of what Representative O'Brien mentioned, which was, just shifting how much, instead of paying this, then we're just going to reallocate things this way to make adjustments for that. So maybe they haven't been charging this, but now they would consider charging it.
John?
I'm getting more and more confused. This bill then adjusts the minimum wage based on Vermont's minimum wage.
Right.
Right?
Which is 1442.
But if you're paying, so if you're paying the minimum wage, but you're providing housing, you're paying the minimum wage, but you can deduct from the pay that amount.
Right.
Is that right?
But you still can't go below the minimum wage, the state minimum wage.
But you are going below because you're paying them less than, you're paying them in the minimum wage, but their check is lower than the minimum wage. Is that not right?
Well, currently, I mean, again, the testimony has been that often people are paying above minimum wage, but right now you're legally required to be paying agricultural workers the federal minimum wage, and you have the right to deduct this. But you whatever you do, you cannot go below the minimum wage.
You keep saying that and it keeps putting me right back where I was. You can't go below it, meaning they've got to get that much,
They have to receive the minimum wage in their paycheck.
even if they're getting the housing.
Right. So if you're paying them more, more than the minimum wage, you can then deduct an amount for the housing. Again, if there's board as well, you could deduct for that.
So if you're the farmer and you're paying only minimum wage and providing housing, you get nothing for the housing.
Right. You wouldn't be able to charge for this.
So I think that this was probably set up at some point way back when to prevent employers from taking advantage of their employees by saying, here, we're paying you, I will pay you $10 an hour. And and you get housing, which I'm going to deduct something for that. And they could deduct whatever they wanted. So this would have set up some sort of a limit. But as Representative Lipsky says in 29, it might have been $3 a night. And how could anybody have thought that was a reasonable number? Anyway.
I would expect, in the good, bad old days,
Yeah.
whatever. I mean, things like the script, in the company towns where people really were restricted in what they were able to do. So a lot of these rules around what employers can deduct, I think, stems from that era.
Go ahead, John.
What's the federal minimum?
725. 1442 at the moment. But that does, I mean, again, not guaranteed to go up. I guess it depends on what happens with the consumer price index. I don't want to assume anything these days, but typically that goes up each year, whereas the federal minimum wage has not moved since 2009. So it's a much more static number.
Representative Bosman.
So I'm still just trying to understand, I think the same thing that John's struggling with. So if we change the policy, if we change the law so that it's all farm workers will get Vermont minimum wage, can a farmer then deduct the 112.41 because the federal minimum wage still would be, like, they would still be above the federal minimum wage, so that, like, in terms of the payment, they'd be getting Vermont's minimum wage, but in terms of the technicality of the being able to deduct room and board, they could do it because they would be receiving more than the federal minimum wage.
I think if you say that they're going to be covered by the state minimum wage, then this would require that they be paid the state minimum wage and that they receive at least the state minimum wage, even after any deductions for this. I don't know that you could change that.
I think it's confusing to me, and I think I was misinterpreting the statute when we had this conversation previously. It almost seems as though that whatever the amounts here are irrelevant, because would be irrelevant. If the minimum wage applies, we would be saying you have to the paycheck has to be the minimum wage, and if you're providing lodging, you're providing lodging. It doesn't make any difference, and it really doesn't matter what numbers are up here. Am I getting that right?
If you were paying minimum wage, yes. If you were paying more than minimum wage, then you would be able to take the deduction as long as you don't bring people down below the minimum wage.
So is the reverse also true, where if if I was the farmer paying my ag workers Vermont minimum wage, could I then charge them rent at these rates? And not be run afoul essentially of Vermont.
I think it depends on whether the housing is connected to the employment. If you're only in the housing because you're employed there, then this would apply. If you're choosing to, you have, a property that you're choosing to rent out and you have an employee that lives there, you can charge them the fair market rent. But then if they lose their job, they wouldn't automatically lose their housing. Like they would still have the right to remain in that housing. They'd be subject to the same landlord tenant, rules around that. So I think as long as you're requiring somebody or making available housing with the job, like this job comes with housing, then this applies. If you've separated the two, then you could do the fair market rental for the housing.
Could you do sort of farmer employer rates here also when it comes with the housing? Like if you work on my farm, I'm gonna pay you Vermont minimum wage and you get housing, but it's sort of a very low rental per week or month.
You could do that again, as long as they're getting paid the minimum wage. But again, if the housing is not connected to the job, I think you would have to have that separation.
Even when it is connected. So say you're, 112 a week. So if it's, I'm gonna pay you minimum wage, but I'm gonna essentially, you have to pay, $500 a month for room and board.
I'm not sure I'm understanding what the difference is. If they're working for you and the housing is connected to the job, then you can deduct, again, for the full room, $32.56 a week, as long as that deduction doesn't push them below the minimum wage, the payment of minimum wage.
So I think basically if it sounds like if we make it required that agricultural workers get the minimum wage and we have farm workers who are living in farm worker housing. I mean, I just did the math and it's $2.81 would be the amount you could deduct from a 40-hour work week in terms of coming up with that 112 figure. So basically we're requiring farmers who provide housing not only to meet the minimum wage, but actually to also pay almost an extra $3 an hour because they're not able to get the deduction from the rental costs. So basically we're saying I think that this feels like surprising news to me. Did you know this before?
Well, not exactly, no. I think that we're really not talking about the bottom line, full room and board in most cases. I think we're talking about full room. So we're not talking about food. We're talking about lodging. So it may be even worse than you're describing, Michelle. So I think what we should do is stop here. I think we've all sort of gotten to a point where we're. Sophie, are you, is your day, I know that everybody's busy now, are you tied up?
I'm pretty much tied up all day today.
If I wanted to find you just to chat at lunchtime, are you tied up then too?
I have an agenda planning meeting with a committee at lunchtime, but I'm not sure if they will be doing that or not, but
Okay.
just let me know and I can come back up here at noon or whatever and see.
Okay, good. I'll try and track you down.
Okay,
Thank you. Thank you for coming in.
you're very welcome.
One more thing, Sophie, for this committee, I'd love to see the federal, both the wage and the benefits that come with H-2A workers would be interesting to compare.
Yes,
Because that's the same thing, you can't go below a minimum.
right. And they've now added in that you can take a deduction for housing as well. So that's a new thing that came out with their interim final rule in October. Which previously you didn't. It was like you had to provide the housing and the wage.
That's the good response.
All right, thank you.
All right.
So we're going to keep going here just to stay on track and switch gears over to H758, which is the an act relating to ban the use of rodenticides. We had some testimony before our break from the Agency of Agriculture. And today we have those folks back along with Department of Fish and Wildlife. So welcome. And our committee assistant is here virtually today rather than here. But if you need assistance with putting anything up on the screen, to make that happen. So, John, are you going to start off?
I thought I would introduce the topic.
Wonderful.
Team,
Come on up then.
and then turn it over to our presenters. And if it's okay with the committee, perhaps Bree or Dr. Renfrew can work on setting up while I offer the introduction, just to mindful of time.
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Thank you for being efficient.
You'd like two chairs up there?
Do you want to both be up front? Why don't we do
Yeah,
that?
you can use that round there.
An extra chair.
Yeah.
An extra chair, yeah. Or if you want a more comfortable chair.
Thank you.
For Dr. Renfrew, of course. The older person.
Okay. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is John Austin. I am the Director of the Wildlife Division with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. I'd like to be with you this morning. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about H758. With me this morning is my team. I have Dr. Rosalind Renfrew, who is the Wildlife Diversity Program Manager, and Ms. Bree Furphy, who is our Fur Bear Project Leader. They're here today to share with you our current understanding on science of presence of rodenticides in wildlife and what we know and what we don't know regarding the effects of that exposure. I want to acknowledge our colleagues from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets. They'll introduce themselves, of course, but I just want to note that we are here in the spirit of interagency collaboration, working together to address shared interests around an important topic. And then before I turn it over to Dr. Renfrew, I just want to make clear that from the standpoint of the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, we remain concerned about the presence of these poisons in the food chain. There's a lot that we still don't know. I think that we collectively agree is with our partners from the Agency of Agriculture that more needs to be done to try and reduce the exposure of these substances in the environment and in our wildlife food chain. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Renfrew and go from there.
Thank you, John. Good morning.
Good morning. Just need a second to set up.
Okay.
Well, thank you for having us today. Appreciate the time. Look forward to your questions.
And if you want to broadcast something on the screen behind you,
Yes.
you'll need permission to share. And if you don't have that, just say so out loud and it will happen.
Oh, I wish everything worked that way.
So
Look at that, it happened.
And get it into,
Powers that be.
there we go. Oops, did not want to do that. Trying to be able to see my notes. See if I can do this one more time. I guess that's not going to work. Bear with me.
Push escape and just have a smaller screen that you view. Your text will be at the bottom, but then you'll see it too. So I don't know if that's off.
Yeah, that's okay. I might just try without notes, and if I stumble a little, that's should work. It's worked in the past.
Well, we're forgiving of stumbling, so.
I appreciate that.
And I think Representative Baldwin's right. If you're screen sharing, we're going to see whatever's on your screen.
Yeah.
There we go. Great. Thanks for your patience. So for the record, my name is Rosalind Renfrew, and I'm the Wildlife Diversity Program Manager at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I really appreciate you being interested in this issue and inviting us here to talk today. So I was asked to speak about rodenticides in birds, specifically in birds of prey. And I know you've heard testimony from several rehabilitators. I haven't watched all of that testimony, so apologize in advance if I repeat anything. What the issue in Vermont is that we don't have studies, right? We have these observations from rehabilitators, but we don't have studies looking at the bigger picture. And so what I thought might be helpful for this group is to do some literature search, look at studies that take offer a broader perspective on what's going on with rodenticides and raptors. And I focused on the second generation rodenticides, which hopefully this committee is really.
Sorry, that was me.
Hopefully this committee is really used to.
Sorry, I was trying to figure this out.
Mute yourself.
There we go. Okay.
Testing. Okay, we're good. Really used to hearing the word eschars. I'd like to just use that terminology to avoid a lot of extra. So second generation anticoagulant rodenticides. So I'm not a toxicologist. I've dabbled in it a little bit because I am my background's in bird research and conservation. So I have some understanding, but if you haven't already, I would recommend having a toxicologist come in and talk. And I understand one of the committee members here might be a toxicologist. I don't know which one. I haven't met you all before. So I wanted to present what I could find from the literature, especially the recent literature about like sort of the state of the knowledge and what's missing from that knowledge. So what I found was that, most studies are conducted in the US and Canada, Europe, Australia. There's a few studies elsewhere in the world, but this is where the majority come from. And Rodificum is the most commonly found compound in the livers of raptor species. It's usually present in these studies in more than 80% of the species of the birds that are looked at. Again, this is all based on birds that are brought into rehab facilities or already found dead. And one thing to be aware of is that this is what we have to work with are the birds that are brought into these centers. It is not representative of the population as a whole. We're getting a sort of a biased sample in that data. It doesn't mean that is not meaningful data. It's all we have is to be looking at the livers of these birds that have died. Blood tests are not, they can indicate exposure potentially. I think they're still working on refining those tests to be more accurate, but they don't represent sort of the cumulative effect of multiple exposures, which is important in a compound like this that can accumulate in a bird's liver. And so that idea of one exposure versus multiple it's really hard to know what the bird experienced. And so you come in with a toxicity level in the liver, but you kind of don't know how the bird got to that point. But blood tests generally test what's happened very recently in terms of exposure, and livers are better for representing sort of the entirety of their exposure to a compound. So of those that come in and test positive for eschars, 1/3 to 2/3 tend to be exposed to more than one of those compounds, which we know increases their risk if they're exposed to multiple different compounds, because that means they've had multiple exposures.
Got a question here, Representative Bartholomew.
What is that you say is commonly found? I don't know. What is that?
Rodificum?
Yes.
So that's one of the several eschars that is used presently, and it's one that's used, it's very commonly used, and it also happens to be more toxic than the other compounds in general to raptor
Which
species.
generation is it?
These are all, I'm just talking about the second generation today. Yeah. And what we do know is that the effects of these compounds are really vary among species, groups of species and species of birds. They all have different diets. They have different ways of processing the toxicity, and they may pick up the compounds at different levels in different environments, depending on the habitats they use. So it's really hard to draw broad generalizations, but you know, you would need a lot of studies in order to be able to get down to the species level in terms of the birds that are living out in the wild and figuring out what's going on with them.
So, Brian?
Have studies been done on sub-lethal effects on these raptors, and also is it passed on to, you know, eggs and chicks?
So I can answer the first question, I'll be getting to that that's actually a big focus of what I'll talk about. So if you want to see if that gets at your question, I'll continue on. The ways that raptors are exposed, I think you've already learned a lot about this, consuming target and non-target rodent species. The contaminant can be spread outside of out of the boxes or treatment areas through the rodents themselves or through scavengers. And there is some evidence of being exposed through invertebrates, especially for songbirds like house sparrows, which are not a native species, but I guess they will go into the boxes. So you can have this cascading impact through invertebrates, although that hasn't been studied much and it hasn't been of most concern. So there's a lot of studies that have just looked at the proportion of raptors that have been exposed. And these are just two that I pulled out for no particular reason. They just seem to have decent sample sizes. And so as an example, percent of raptors exposed was 92 in Australia and 74 in Canada. And of those, 38% and 50% were exposed to multiple compounds. You can see that at the top there, the number of birds that were evaluated. Again, these are all birds that came into rehab centers or were found already dead. And the environments that these studies took place in, the environments that these birds came from really varied. So it encompassed a lot of different kinds of land use. In Canada, the highest proportion of birds exposed was in suburban and intensive ag areas. And this is one positive note that I'll share is that there was in Western Canada, there was a policy change in 2013 where, excuse me, where they reduced the levels of the brodifacoum, that more toxic compound, and increased the levels of the other types of eschars in terms of what was used in the landscape. Thank you. And they found that actually a couple of species owls, they found lower levels in their livers after that reduction. So to me, that indicated, okay, this can work. If you reduce what's used, it can be reflected in the raptors. And that's an important finding and an important sort of bright light in terms of the possibilities. So the majority of studies have focused on that top box of are the eschars present in the birds or not, the birds that are coming into rehab centers and such. What would be more helpful or additionally helpful is to know what levels are we seeing that are lethal, what is the threshold for lethality? At what point, what level of concentration in the liver causes mortality? And then also, very hard to study are the sublethal effects, because oftentimes we're never going to see the birds experiencing sublethal effects. They may not die, or if they do die, we may not find them. And they may die of other causes because they become vulnerable due to the pesticide exposure. They become compromised in some way, and then they die from some other cause. So that's a really hard one to get at.
Nelson?
Yeah. How is our population of raptors? How is our population? Eagles have been delisted now. How is our population of other raptors?
In general, it depends on the species. Cooper's hawks and sharp-shinned hawks are doing pretty well. They've kind of come back post DDT era, and also they seem to be coming more acclimated to coexisting with humans on the landscape. So they're having good success. Goshawks, there's some questions about how they're doing, and that might be due to competition from other raptors. It might be due to habitat changes. I don't think we know the answer, and there is research and monitoring going on right now around those species. Owls, again, it depends on the species. Some have done well, others have declined. And the caveat I want to give you is that we don't have really good monitoring efforts that get at these population trends for raptors at a more local level. So we have the Breeding Bird Atlas, which covers the whole country. And if you take all the data together, you can say generally how are owls or how is this species of hawk doing writ large. But for Vermont, we don't have fine enough scale surveys to really get at population changes. The one exception would be the Vermont Breeding Bird Atlas, which we survey the whole state and we look at just presence of the species across our landscape. But those are such big projects. They're only done once every 25 years. So you can look at, and we're actually coming up on our next one. We're starting to get ready for it. So we have data from back in, 2003 to 2007 collected back then on them. We're about to do the next round. But even if you saw an increase or a decrease, you don't know, you're not looking at necessarily what the underlying cause is. And obviously there's a lot of other things that impact bird populations. So it can be very hard to tease out these population level impacts. But ultimately, that's really what we're looking at Fish and Wildlife, where nobody wants to see any raptor exposed to toxicity, excuse me, to the level where they die or experience sublethal effects, right?
And it's a dry room.
Thank you. I just don't want to have this in my mouth while I'm talking.
Dr. Renford, these raptors, except for the barred owl that was sitting on my clothesline over the bird feeder waiting for a mouse to come out this winter in the daylight. Most of these raptors are migratory. They don't hang out here, but only for 4 or 5 months at the most. The rest of the time they're elsewhere. So we don't know if you're in your studies that they were exposed to the rodents carrying escars here or elsewhere.
Well, this is true. You can't really separate that out without doing a study specifically looking at that. I have not seen studies doing that, but that said, it depends on how long the effects of the compound last in the liver, how fast the bird processes it. So you may, if you're just testing birds during the breeding season while they're here, whether or not their liver concentration reflects what happened 3 months ago when they were moving from the south. I mean, that's something a toxicologist could speak to. I'm not prepared to, yeah. So let's see. I think so here's some studies in the lab that you always start in the lab, right? You look at birds where you can have controlled experimental situation. You dose them, you find out what the impacts are. They often use quails, mallards, and chickens. These don't relate well to exposure in raptors. They just process things differently. Fortunately, they did do some studies with hawks and owls, kestrels and owls at least. And long story short, they came up with this number of 100 to 200 nanograms per gram of liver. And that's the area at which they think that escars become lethal, potentially lethal. And they also note that there may be liver damage, but you may not see that in a live animal. So you can't necessarily look at an animal and say whether or not it has liver damage. And that's kind of important as well. It makes it harder to figure out what's going on in the wild. Also, these studies are limited because in what they call free living birds out in the wild, they're subject to a lot of other stressors that can compound with the impacts of any kind of contaminant. So you can have them more susceptible or more impacted by a certain level in the liver compared to lab animals. So again, this is the number that they came up with as their best guess at where the escars become a problem for these species. And of course, that level is going to vary based on the species, the timing, their diet, their age, their behavior, their habitat, their level of nutrition, all kinds of other factors, but they have to go with something. And so studies have applied that threshold and looked at how many of the birds coming into rehab facilities are above or below that threshold to kind of take a guess at what the potential mortality could be in raptors. And so this is just a handful. There's fewer of these studies. And this is a handful of results from different places. So Australia found that about half of the birds that they looked at with exposure were above these levels. Another study in Texas found that half of the birds that came in were exposed, period, and then a quarter of those were tested at potentially lethal levels in that 100 to 200 range. In Europe, sparrowhawks, this was a big study over a long period of time. They found that there was a lot of birds exposed, but that all of them were below these lethal levels. So you can see how these studies really vary. It's very hard to take away one conclusion because we're still learning so much about this.
Representative O'Brien.
Are there any nations that have banned eschars and so they can study, sort of either post eschar or they never actually had rodenticides like this to begin with and see, what compare that health of those raptors to, raptors here, for example?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I looked more into just impacts on birds. I didn't look so much into policy, and except for that one example in Canada where they didn't ban them, but they changed which compounds they were using. So maybe there's someone else in this room that can speak to other countries and their policies. I haven't gone into that yet. Sorry.
What are some of the other sort of existential stressors on like the raptor population now? Right, if it's cumulative, raptors are like, F-35s, like everything has to work really well for them to survive. So if you just start tweaking here and there.
Right. So do you mean
or are there other toxicities out there, or?
Lead can be a toxin, and perhaps that interacts with exposure to eschars as well. So they could be exposed to lead through capture of prey that have lead. I'm not aware of anything currently that's that's on the radar for exposure. But I'm probably missing something. But there's nothing that I'm aware of that's on the radar in a big way, at least not in our region.
So that we haven't seen declines in some of these raptors the way, I know things like evening grosbeaks are down, but some enormous amount, like 40%. And ornithologists don't really know why. So are there similar things with raptor populations?
There are some species that have declined, and there's theories posited about why. And again, it's hard to pinpoint. A lot of it is sort of just carrying out logical exercise of changes. A lot of times it's changes in their habitat or changes in competition with other raptors. So there's those kinds of dynamics all the time. Yeah. So this, and as an alternative to relying on the lab studies, there are a couple studies at least that used wild birds and asked a slightly different question that helps inform us. They compared the eschar levels in the livers of birds that were determined with pretty good certainty to have died from that exposure to the eschars. And they compared that to other raptors and their liver levels that died due to other causes. And using that information, you can actually create a model to help predict at what level a bird is likely to die and what is the likelihood that it will die. So the risk to the bird from a given level found in the liver. And so on the top, you see on the top and the bottom of that graph, you see a bunch of gray circles. That's the actual data. So up at the top are the raptors that were found to be diagnosed as having died from exposure. At the bottom are all the ones that were diagnosed as having died from some other cause. And so when you run the model, and it's hard to imagine just looking at this graph, but you run a model and you can get a continuum of the probabilities of death based on the liver exposure to a compound. And this study took all the SGARs and just combined them. So we're not getting at that, like the different levels of toxicity from the different compounds, but it is a general look at SGARs overall. And this was done in the UK with a couple of species. I'm just showing one of them. And so if you follow along on the x-axis is the liver concentration, the residue in the liver, and on the y-axis is the probability of death given that level of exposure. And so if you follow along in the green on that x-axis, the probability of death is 0. All those levels of exposure are not causing mortality. You get up above 50 and you start seeing the curve go up. That means the probability of mortality starts increasing. And so what they concluded was that, well, at around 55, instead of the 100 to 200, around 55, you'll start seeing some probability of mortality. And so this is giving us a little more information. It's also saying that for this particular species and for the whole combination of SGARs, that 100 to 200 gram threshold may be too high. They may be dying at lower levels, but it also says, that this all depends on risk, right? Are you okay with saying, okay, 5% mortality is an acceptable risk, or 1% is an acceptable risk? Certainly 50% probably for most people would not be an acceptable risk. So it comes down to a risk analysis. And that's what I think a lot of this comes down to, actually.
Representative Nelson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair.
Mhm.
Doc, red kites are little bitty bird, aren't they?
They're smaller, yeah.
Yeah, so 50 nanograms per gram in the liver on a little itty bitty bird would be different than on a.
One can assume that. Yep.
Okay.
Just an example of this approach, I guess. I'm not trying to
No,
extrapolate to other species. Yeah, that's a good point, though.
I'm picking up what you're laying down. I think maybe to
Yeah.
understand it as well.
Yeah. This is a similar study, but I thought was more helpful because it does separate out 3 compounds they were interested in looking at. So you can see the 3. Is that visible? It's a little small. So brodifacoum, bromadiolone, I'm going to just destroy these words, bromadiolone, diphthiolone. They looked at those 3 compounds and separated those out. And they also looked at different groupings of birds, different kinds of raptors. So that it's not a species level difference they're looking at, but at least it's grouping the birds, based on similarities. And so that's really helpful. They had a bigger sample size to work with. They were very careful to only use postmortem exams that were carried out by certified vets. So they had a high level of certainty of the diagnosis. And so same thing, they looked at liver levels for those diagnosed with having died from a compound versus those diagnosed having died due to some other cause. And so they ran the model, they generate this curve. The curve is on a log scale. It's a little hard to interpret directly. But the curve there shows the differences you can see among the different compounds, right? The different sort of levels of effects that would be predicted. And again, this is predictive model. It's not necessarily truth. But in table 2 is what I really wanted to focus on, which shows that for these groups, they're actually saying that if you want to look at a 5% chance of mortality, that you would actually have to allow a much lower level of exposure to these compounds by quite a bit. And so these birds were collected in various sites in both Canada and the US. It represents a lot of different places. But it gives us an overall picture of, what levels are okay. It's going to vary from study to study. It's going to vary depending on the species. But we'll see what other studies come up with. I'm sure there's more going on. This is a very large data set. It's using a lot of the data that already exists out there. But it's becoming more conservative about what levels are allowable. And again, not a random sample. There's bias. This is opportunistic sampling, right? So this isn't somehow relating to what the overall populations are experiencing. This is just trying to get at what levels cause mortality.
Right.
Are there certain species of raptors that never aren't interested really in house mice or Norway rats, that just the sort of merlins or kestrels that might just like chickadees and goldfinches? I'm just wondering, you can see something like turkey vultures or bald eagles, right? Like, easy things, they're opportunists where those are, peregrines. I can't imagine a peregrine diving 200 miles an hour to pick off a house mouse that has just been in a rodenticide box.
Yeah, so there are, and that's why these groupings are what they are. So the accipiters, that first column of birds you see, they eat birds mostly. They might eat other things as well, but like Cooper's hawk and sharp-shinned hawk, they go after birds quite a bit. They don't go after mammals. The peregrines go after birds almost exclusively. They're not going to be eating other things. They'll grab a dragonfly once in a while, actually. But the owls, of course, most of the owls that we have are focused on the mammals, but they're also bigger. So you can see that the toxicity allowable level, if you want to call it that, is higher for owls. So yes, and I wonder if you're getting at, can we look at the population trends of these species that are eating birds and other things versus those eating mammals? And you could, again, there's a lot of other factors influencing their population trends. So
it also
hard to
seems
get
like no matter what the levels of eschars in them means that their whatever prey they ate had to be exposed to rodenticides. So like a barred owl, on top of, camel thumb is going to be exposed to rodenticides the same way one might be in Williston, right?
Correct. One would expect it's going to be in areas of concentrated human activity of some sort.
Yeah.
Right. Yep. And I think that's what they've found, and maybe my colleagues in the ag department can speak to that a bit. So that's all I have for all the technical stuff. I just threw these out off the top of my head of all the information needs. There's a lot we don't know, and I won't go through all of this, but it's just an example of the things I'd love to know to help inform our interests and how we want to handle this issue. But on the other hand, do we want to wait for all that research to do something? I think we're ready to do something now, and it's a matter of what that is.
Reverend Bartholomew.
Two questions. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier invertebrates. How in the world would these compounds get into invertebrates?
Through invertebrates for these.
How would it get into, you said if something eats invertebrates, these compounds can appear.
So
How did it get into the invertebrate?
Well, what I'm aware of is the case of a house sparrow. They will actually they can fit into and will go into the boxes to eat like snails, things like that, or maggots they could eat maggots on a carcass. And so they can pick it up that way. Again, I don't think this is happening.
Are eating the feed and the actual entrails.
They're eating the invertebrates that are, scavenging on the dead small mammals. Yeah.
No, so the information you're providing is just reinforcing what we've heard is that there is an effect in wildlife and in birds. So do you have any recommendations on what you think we should do? Since you're here?
That's a big question. That's something that I think we need to actually figure out collectively. I am not an expert on the other end of things, the use of the pesticides, the alternatives. One thing that, I'd love to see, but I don't think we're going to be able to get at is that nexus of, we're talking about how they're used more often in, environments where there's more people, there's more need for them, right? I'd love to be able to learn more about, what raptors are using those areas and how many, what is the nexus between use and exposure, and be able to do that for Vermont, right? So in our place, so that we're not just relying on these big, broad studies, but that we actually understand our own landscape.
New York City skyscrapers.
Yes, but they're eating pigeons, so they're probably okay.
Representative Bosland.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I can't recall exactly when the testimony came in, but we have heard from people who did studies, not of birds. I mean, we have heard of people who did studies of birds too, but Vermont specific data about mammals in Vermont. And I recall with fishers in particular, they said there was an extraordinarily high incidence. Are you the fisher person?
This is a perfect
Okay.
segue.
All right. So I was gonna say, like, some of the question that Richard was asking about in terms of, well, maybe the birds got it somewhere else, maybe, but the mammals probably were here. So anyway, if you're gonna remind us, great.
So just wanted to do a time check. We're about out of time on this bill. So I'm not sure who else wanted to share anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Really quick.
I'll do my best.
John, yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I too am mindful of time, and this is clearly a very complicated topic. I wonder if perhaps in this first we can start, but there's a lot of information yet to go through, and we do need to hear from our colleagues from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, because there's some important background in terms of what has been going on and what has already been done that needs to be part of the conversation. So perhaps there could be another opportunity for us to come back.
Yeah, so we're about out of time, both on the clock and on the calendar, just because we have a crossover date looming. We do have time this afternoon, and we've got some time blocked out for this bill for committee discussion, and we could certainly, if folks are available, have you come back in between 2:30 and 3:30.
That work for you?
I'm supposed to pick up a rooster, but.
Why don't we get, while we have you here, why don't we just see what we can do, and we'll maybe ask the committee to hold questions and tell us what you can in a few minutes.
Yeah. Well, I believe, for the record, my name is Brian Furphy. I'm the Fur Bearer Products Lead for Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife. Let me make sure that I know how to sign in here and try to make this as fast as possible.
The good thing about Bree's information is that she actually does have data from Vermont.
Yes. Right, that's what I
Unlike
recall.
birds where you're just using these other studies, so it's helpful.
Let's see, share screen. All right, perfect. Well, so to do this in like maybe 5 minutes, I do want to emphasize that this isn't a problem only in Vermont. This is a problem throughout the Northeast. It's a problem throughout America. It's a problem in other countries. We're not the only state that's encountering this issue. The good news, as Dr. Renfrew said, that yeah, we have some data to work with, and we are going to continue to collect data to refine some of the questions and answers that we're trying to get to. We're collaborating with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, who's provided some funding to do some of the testing for rodenticide exposure. Let's see here. So to do this fast, the main things that I wanted to show the committee is the high exposure rates of SJARs. So for FJARs being the first generation anticoagulant rodenticides, SJARs secondary. And so what you can see here is that Fisher has the highest exposure, followed by Bobcat. And in the slash line there, it's showing that there is a number of animals that we're testing that is testing positive for both FJARs and SJARs. We have the highest sample size for Fisher, and we've been sampling since 2018. We use trapper drive carcasses in order to get this information, and so that is their ultimate cause of death. So we wouldn't be able to tell whether or not that animal would have died from rodenticide exposure. We just know their history of exposure through their liver. So also keep in mind that there's some areas in Vermont that are sampled more often than others. And so those areas might be overrepresentative of what our results are, whereas some areas that aren't sampled, it could be underrepresented. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at these results. The majority of samples that we have tested in Vermont have showed a positive detection for Fisher. Whether that's trace amounts, which is below the it's the detection limit. It's not a number, it's just below that. So it's showing that it is at some point exposed. We just don't know the actual amount. So it's pretty low. So I included that in this data set to just show that the amount of Fisher that we have that we've sampled has varied with everything from trace amounts to pretty high amounts. And then in the slashed areas, it's showing that there's a mix of positive and negative detections. So in other words, in some years, they were positive, in some years they were negative. And then for some reason, there was one town there that has no positive detections, and that is the town of Warren, which is random. Yeah. What that means, I don't know. So just to show the amount of second generation positive samples that are coming back for Fisher has been pretty steady and reliable at being fairly high of an exposure rate, whereas first generation seems to be declining over time. Still a small sample set. There's not, any definites that we could take from this, but we can say that, perhaps FJARs are being used less. And so maybe that's why we're seeing it less. And it could also mean that second generations are staying in their bodies longer. So we're detecting it over time more and more. Difacinin was the most common first generation anticoagulant rodenticide, and brodifacan. I call it Brody for short. It's the most common SJAR. And so that's very similar to what's found in birds. It's very similar to what's found in Fisher and literature and other carnivorous mammals. The average concentration for the FJARs, even though it's declining overall, the exposure rate is declining in Fisher. The concentration seems to be increasing on average. Same thing with the secondary anticoagulant rodenticides, and how this compares to literature is that it fits right in. It's more that we can contribute to literature and our knowledge of this issue. The main thing about this Brody, about this compound, is that it has a higher liver retention rate. And so what that means is that it could, with birds, what you just heard from Dr. Renfrew is that they might be it might take less for birds to be impacted more so than mammals, but it's highly variable, dependent on the condition of the animal, the age, the sex. During this time of year, they might be a little bit more stressed out because they're getting ready to breed. So yeah, time of year. So all of these things play a role. It's not a simple issue. It's very difficult to study. And I just wanted to point out that the liver retention rates with this particular compound, it affects detection more than than potency, because it has such a long duration at which it stays in the liver. So we could test Fisher 10 years from now, and even if this compound was not on the shelves, say it was banned, just as an example, we would still find this compound probably in Fisher livers because it stays, it bioaccumulates in their body the most. Trace amounts, just here wanted to show that the last test that we have was from the 2023 trapping season, and we had the majority of the samples really showing up as like trace amounts, which at first I was like, woo, that's great. But then I was like, wait a second, nope, that's not right, because it means that there's more exposure on the landscape. And we have maps we can pinpoint down to the town level of where animals are getting exposed. So here I'm showing Fisher and Bobcat. And even though the sample sizes are a little bit different, I think that the regulated trapping seasons, they provide those carcasses for us to test the liver to cast a wide net on where we can find rodenticides. It's very difficult to study. It's difficult to figure out if there's lethal effects. You could test the blood, but it's not going to give you the complete picture. You could do fecal studies, but again, it's not going to give you the complete picture, especially when we look at that one compound Brody, where it stays in the body for the longest. So really, ideally, liver samples are the best samples that you can get. And then finally, otter. Unfortunately, we found that otter have trace amounts in the southeastern portion of the state. What does that mean? We don't know yet, but it could have a lot of different directions of what that could mean. And it's something that we plan on looking into further. So that's pretty much, and hopefully was that 5 minutes? I'm not sure, but that was pretty close.
Just while we're all thinking about Brody, and maybe there's a question for your colleagues, what's the trade name? And does it make sense that that's the one that seems to keep showing up in toxicology?
Yeah, the Steve Winnell, AG Agriculture Food Market. So the product that's actually reported to be used the most in different products, bromadiolone, vertifacome is reported to be used, and it has a bunch of different brand names. We have a lot of registrations for that product. But in terms of the use that's reported to us by the pest control companies, it's bromadiolone that's used most frequently. So then we can get you that information. Actually, I provided it to you in my testimony the other day. It's in one of the slides in there, but yeah.
It's a little confusing because they both start with the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But is it the same second generation that you were
Yeah,
referring
they're
to?
both second generation.
They're both second generation. And actually
I'm sorry, they're both second generation, but are you talking in your presentation, Dr. Were you referring to the same second generation?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Can we give you just a couple of questions?
Sure.
All right, a couple more questions, Representative Nelson.
Fisher and Bobcat populations, robust.
They are normal. We're not seeing any sort of declines, and we have a variety of different types of information.
And no data since we started making second gen restricted use.
Well, again, even if we had made that restricted use in, what was it, 2024, there are compounds, again, that stay in the liver for a long time, so it would take us at least like 10 years to start noticing a difference.
And we haven't looked at the non-ARs. Well, fluorocalciferol or the vitamin D one,
Yeah, Boltoceprol is and bromomethrin is the most widely used non-antiflammatory. So bromomethrin, but I don't know if that's included in your screen.
It is, so bromo, oh, no, bromo.
Yeah, it's not an
no.
anticoagulant, it's entirely different compound.
Yes, that's the neurological one.
Right,
Yep.
yeah.
No, we haven't looked into that. So I don't think it's part of the screenings.
Okay,
for that.
thank you.
Representative Lipsky.
Thank you. In a much earlier slide, Warren stood out, but Lamoille County was dense and maybe even Stowe was a dark maroon. Earlier, yeah,
Next one down.
next one.
Slide 14, maybe.
Well, it has the maroon ones on it, I think he wants
Keep going, please.
The other way, go back up. More.
This one?
one more,
Oh, okay, there you go.
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah, maybe it's brown or black, but it looks sort of like a aubergine.
The 7 to 10,
The 7 to 10,
so they
yeah.
had.
Which one's Stowe, Ted?
Well, I'm just curious, what was the habitat where, if it is snow, which is I'm trying to envision,
Craftsbury area.
there could have been Craftsbury.
Mhm. Yeah, so that's where we were having a lot of samples randomly tested.
The Craftsbury is Caledonia County or Orleans.
Craftsbury is up a couple.
So that's just an intensity of the sample. of number.
Right.
Yeah. Sampling distribution.
That is from Massey Track and Solar.
So, and this isn't showing that, the other maps are showing where they were being exposed the most. This is just the sampling distribution, so where our samples are coming from and how many there
The
are.
crimson or the red.
Yep,
was
so
a little
the
more
darker the,
Memorial County.
yeah, so the darker the color means that there's more samples coming out of those counties. And then the white is that we have no samples from those counties.
Thank you.
Right. Well, let's take one more question.
Just quickly, are parallel studies being done at Fish and Wildlife for the non-fur bearer predators like foxes, coyotes, raccoons, which may be from roadkill, you could test livers?
That's a good question. So as I previously stated, it's really difficult. We haven't actually tested liver from any other species, but if there is roadkill, we have been collecting that just in case there is some sort of correlation between roadkill and rodenticide exposure. We are working with other states and looking into the Northeast health of not only Fisher, but also gray fox. So we're collecting liver of gray fox as well. But then in terms of like red fox and coyote, we haven't collected those samples. We do, given the otter exposure, the question is whether or not our semi-aquatic species, are they getting exposed? How are they getting exposed? Invertebrates, how are they getting exposed? So that might be the next branch of species that we need to start looking at.
I thank you both, and I think we should probably wrap up for now. We'll be able to reschedule you folks for the afternoon, okay? And if Fish and Wildlife would like to come back again, then I know maybe you had a conflict, but with the rooster, but otherwise, we'd be happy to have you. I want to just check and see whether we have Josh Kelly in the room. Hi, Josh. And I apologize. Could we take 5 minutes before okay, you have a little time. All right, committee, let's take a 5-minute break.
Little over